Dr. Joe DeCensi, President of Educational Directions. I'm excited to bring you this topic today, the rhythm of the learner year. We're going to have a specific focus on systems planning and the opening of school, but I'm going to take you through the entire school year so that we can see what the upcoming year might look like for us. So we're going to go through quite a bit today. First, we're going to start with looking at an overview of the learner year itself. We're going to differentiate learning from performance, learning in terms of the neuroscience of learning, performance in terms of the cognitive and non-cognitive legs that go into our five-legged performance model. We're going to look at what data that we have and what data that we might need, identify priorities of work, especially in terms of opening school next year, and then discuss a few things about how next year is going to be different coming out of this last 18 months of pandemic. So we're covering a lot today. If you were able to download the materials that go along with this, there are several activities that help you process some of the major chunks of what we'll be going through today, as well as we have a book available if you really want to get knee deep into all of the things that we're talking about. I tried to put your materials together today to where you don't need the book to be able to put this into practice over the summer and opening school next year. I've defined each one of the sections in kind of a mini brief for each one of the periods, as well as give you the readiness assessments in addition to the processing activities that we'll be doing through the course today. I love it when people get into the book and go knee deep, but at the same time, I don't want you to have to buy anything from us to be able to put these ideas into place. Also, we'll talk about this a little bit at the end. All of our tools are free on our website. So for each period, we have lots of tools beyond just the readiness tool that we've included here, as well as a blog where we're taking very timely topics and workshopping them amongst ourselves and then coming up with answers for the folks that follow the blog. So this particular year, we've been talking a lot about how to apply some of these things to very specific pandemic cases. So whether you're doing hybrid, that sort of thing, we want to make sure that the blog stays timely, as well as having a good reference material that you can use that year after year. So the learner year. We break the learner year into several parts, and we'll talk about each one individually after we go through our learning and performance models. We open school, which is a critical time. We have our formative period where we want to work on students at their ability to learn, finding out where their learning deficits might be, and also to make sure that the culture and climate that we've started in the opening of school have continued. We're going to look at our calibrating period where we want to start to take that learning and make sure they can perform with that learning at the level that they'll be assessed. If you are in a place that has high stakes testing, then there are very specific things that we need to do to activate long-term memory, get best effort, do quite a few other things. So we'll talk about testing. The end of year is critical because the end of year is really the start of the next school year in terms of enculturing and making sure that we're packing things away to where it's retrievable memory when the people come back. And then the summertime, a lot of us don't necessarily have access to our kids over the summer. Some do, and there are some things we can do with those kids. But on the adult side, there's quite a bit we can do unpacking the previous year and planning the next year. So it really does become a 12-month education cycle that overlaps. We use this concept of the rhythm of the learning year for several aspects of learning and building great students. We want to build independent, proficient performers. We don't want students that are teacher dependent or know things but can't perform with that learning to where we think that they haven't learned, where it's more of a performance problem. We want to develop a comfort zone with best effort. We want to make sure that we're constantly pushing them to revise proficiency and giving us their best work and that they know what good work looks like. We want to make sure that we have critical reading, critical writing, and critical thinking strategies in almost everything we do, from the very opening of school to the closing day. We want to build compensating and accommodating strategies for those that struggle or those that hit barriers and sometimes will give up to make sure that they can push through. We create data streams and track initiatives to see what's working and what's not. With any program that we use, we definitely want to start from the idea of do no harm. So we have to track and have some metrics to know what's working and what's not. Finally, we want to establish a perception of what proficient learning and proficient performance looks like, not just for the students, but also for the faculty and sometimes even for leadership as well. These are the byproducts of what using this process of the learner year will establish. So this is a simple graphic that kind of explains our entire process of how we think students learn. It has to happen within a culture and climate that's conducive towards learning. Good learning has to happen, and learning being we are taking content and putting it into retrievable long-term memory. And finally, we can retrieve that long-term memory and perform with it at the level we'll be assessed. So we're going to break each one of these pieces into its own fundamental parts before we get into the just-in-time learner year process. So whether you're watching this as an individual or possibly as a group, this is a place that if you like, you can stop and do one of our self-assessments. This one's on culture and climate. Where do you see your strengths and weaknesses, and what are some things that we need to work on over the summer to make sure we open school as well as we possibly can? So if you want to, you can pause here for a few minutes, go through this. What I usually recommend with a lot of our assessments here is if you are watching as a group, maybe you're using this as a professional development session, have everybody do it individually and then come back together as a group and kind of trend where people see strengths, where people see weaknesses. Does it overlap quite a bit? Are there some real differences of opinion? And then probe into what's going on. So if you want to right now, pause. Otherwise, we'll keep on pushing through. So if we've developed our culture and climate for learning, which is truly important before learning can happen, making sure that the classrooms are moving back and forth, the changing of the halls, the opening of the day, the bus schedule at the end, how lunch goes, all of these trains running on time kind of aspects of the school that really need to be in place before we have everybody with the brain chemistry for learning. So learning is the ability to take the things that are happening in the moment, transfer it into short-term memory, and ultimately get it into long-term memory. We have a better visual that blows out this particular item. This is our neuroscience of learning model. So things are happening. You're walking down the hall, you're seeing people high five, you're walking into a classroom. All of these things are sensory memory, the stimulus that you might notice, and a few minutes later, you couldn't remember if somebody asked you about it. One of the things that we have to do in a classroom, which is one of the reasons why we have to start a class efficiently and effectively, we have to make sure that we have everybody in a good brain chemistry space to put things into short-term memory, which means they need to be able to attend what's going on. So a lot of the transitions of the hallways, the opening of classroom, whatever the bell ringer activity might be, or whatever the ritual and routine that the teacher has established for getting things started, that puts kids into a space to where they're attending and they're putting things into short-term memory. Now, we want to work backwards from students learning, not from what teachers are teaching. So we have to know what we need students to be able to know and what they need to do with that knowledge in terms of how we set up our lesson plans, how we set up the story arc of a particular class. So we're going to work backwards from the translation activities, the meaningful work. Student work should be a top priority in terms of how we build our sessions. So the teacher can teach quite a bit, but ultimately that only gets things into short-term memory. Long-term memory will be achieved by students making meaning of it, putting their own mental hooks into things, them translating it, them having some struggle time to work with concepts and not immediately be rescued, not have the hand get answers as soon as it shoots up. That gets things into long-term memory. And if we get them into a routine of this, that long-term memory is retrievable much later in the year, especially for things that are foundational that the teacher is going to build upon throughout the year. So our learning model really deals with student work, high level, high engagement student work that takes things from sensory memory through what's being taught into them making meaning by doing the actual work, whatever the work assignment. The work should always be more difficult than the teaching because the teaching helps things into short-term memory. We want to get all that information into retrievable long-term memory. So once again, here's a great time to stop. I know we just went through the model itself, but why don't you discuss this as a group, or why don't you look at some of the questions that I have around that model in your activity 2. If you want to pause here, look at this, because this is foundational to us being able to get the students to perform with this retrievable long-term knowledge. We're going to find out that this long-term memory is 20% of performance, and then we're going to look at the rest of what fills out a true independent performing student. So if we've set a culture and climate for learning, we've used good, high level of engagement student work in well thought out classes to get things into long-term memory. Now we need students to be able to retrieve that long-term memory and perform with it. When we look at where work breaks down, most of the time people think content. So if a student is performing well, they must not know it. We're going to expand the concept of what performance looks like into 5 legs that cover both the cognitive and the non-cognitive side of the student. So this is our 5-legged model of performance. This is us taking that long-term retrievable memory and actually performing with it at the level will be assessed, which normally if you want to use a metric or standard, that would be what the state test is going to expect of students. First, we have knowledge. Knowledge is what we know. What we know is what's retrievable from long-term memory. So the learning piece is fundamental to performance. If they don't know it, they can't do something with that knowledge. But let's explore what the other legs of performance look like. The second leg is attitude. This is the student's willingness to invest self in learning and performing. If the student knows the content but is not willing to try, is not willing to do what's being asked of him or her, if a student comes in not even being willing to attend, then there's no level of remediation of knowledge that would help a student with a bad attitude. The attitude is one of the very first things that we have to address. The third leg is perception, which is somewhat tied to attitude. Attitude can be how they feel about the school, how they feel about a teacher, how they feel about the culture and climate around them. Perception is slightly different. We split perception into 2 different pieces. One is perception of proficiency. Do they know what good work looks like? Have they been turning in average work all year that's below the level that the state will require of them, but they've developed a comfort level way below where they need to be? So we need to make sure they understand what proficient work looks like. And over the course of the year, we're pushing them harder and harder to meet that standard. The next is perception of self. If they don't believe in themselves, if they think they're bad students, if they think they have a bad memory, if they think they're a bad test taker, those brain chemicals can get involved and have them give up when they hit a hiccup. It could be that they go in with a poor attitude and they don't give best effort because they just don't think they're capable of it. So understanding how they perceive themselves as learners and performers and how they perceive good work are critical to us knowing where to help them, where interventions come in to help students perform better. Building a learner and performer requires a thinking base that includes habits of mind, seeking clarity, identifying requirements of a question, overcoming impulsive responses, taking the time to make sure that they understand what's being asked, and just all that goes into processing to give a thoughtful response. This is especially important on open-ended questions, open response questions. Do they have the mental processes they need to retrieve that memory, unpack it, and repackage it in the way that they're being assessed? And the final thing is experience. We don't want students to come into contact with a new question for the very first time on a high stakes assessment, whether that be a benchmark, a state test, an ACT, whatever the case. We want to make sure that students have test taking ability. They have the duration, they have the stamina they don't run into a new question type. We try to, in terms of experience, even in terms of some of the high stakes stuff, get them used to their surroundings, get them used to their proctor. And a lot of that we'll talk about when we get into the testing period. But all 5 legs of performance can be equally important. In the book and in your toolkit, we talk a little bit about which ones are force ranked, but we don't want to assume students' poor performance is just a lack of knowledge. It could be any part of this cognitive or non-cognitive pieces, whether it be attitude, perception, experience, metacognition. All of this needs to be identified in terms of when we look at where student work is breaking down. For our third activity, I'd like for everybody to review the five-legged model in your toolkit. We have some additional information there, why it's important, a little more explanation on the legs themselves, and then answer the questions at the beginning of the activity. Where are you weak? Where are you strong? What else do you need in terms of professional development? Does this make sense to you? Do you disagree with any of this? This is going to be fundamental. Our neuroscience of learning and our five-legged model of performance ripple through every aspect of the learner year that we're about to get into next. So please feel free to take a moment and take a peek at the toolkit, or push on through and just know that you can come back to this anytime. So here's one more look with a little more detail in terms of what our learning process and performing process looks like. We're going to, throughout the school year, first start with the culture and climate, making sure that we've provided the environment to learn. Next, we're going to look at student as learner to make sure that we're using our classes. We're working backwards from the student work that's happening to define what our lesson plans are going to look like, to make sure that we have students make meaning in a way that they pack things into long-term retrievable memory. And finally, we're going to spend most of the rest of the year working on the student performance. So we're going to continue to teach them because we have knowledge coming out throughout the year, but we're going to slowly up the rigor and the expectation, and then what we're looking for in terms of where students' performance is breaking down throughout the rest of the final part of the year, ultimately culminating in the testing and then everything we do to get ready for the summer to pack things away for the next year. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on data today, but data, real-time, aggregate, trendable data is incredibly important to making sure all this works right. If you're tracking students as learners and tracking students as performers, the first thing you need to look at is what data do you have? Is it timely? Is it good? Is it probable? Most of the time, a data set doesn't tell us what the answer is. It tells us what the next question is. So how long data take to aggregate, how easy it is, how labor intensive. If you're using standardized scores to do much with your planning, that's probably a fairly fossilized data set. All it tells us is what a historical student was like with a different teacher in different class a long time ago. It lets you know where the school was as a snapshot, but we constantly need real-time iterative data to help us with students. We need to have data to inform our planning and things that we can put into place where other teachers can benefit from a data set captured from a given teacher, especially in terms of where performance breaks down, because that may be in no way subject related. We use data to track school trends. So we want to track students as individuals, but at the same time, if we track our data correctly, we can take a snapshot of how the school overall is improving, not improving, what interventions are working, what interventions are working for some folks and not others. And one of the toughest things about opening school next year is how little or how bad the data is coming out of the pandemic. If you mostly had hybrid or NTI and you're going to be full in class, everybody's like it's a pre-pandemic year starting next year, the data that came out of the 2021 school year is not the best. It may help you with some knowledge pieces, but in terms of attitude, where students are weak, where students are strong. If there were performance gaps before, they may have widened. If for students that have been out of school for up to a year and a half, some of the socialization and culture and climate pieces may be difficult. So realize that in terms of student data and making good decisions off of that, we're going into a very blind year in terms of the data sets we have coming out of 2021. So this is going to be incredibly crucial to have a good data plan developed this summer, ready to hit the ground running with assessments, batteries of tests, anything that we can grab from last year, anything we need to ignore because it's really fossilized and not representative, and we don't want to make decisions of where students are based on where they're not. So think a little bit about your data, and we've got some tools that can help you with that on our blog. So the rhythm of the learner year, when we talk about culture, climate, student as learner, student as performer, this is the central hub of everything we think about in terms of how we break up the year, going from the opening of school, the formative period, the calibrating period, prepping for testing, having a good testing cycle and coming out of testing, and finally ending the year in a way that goes ahead and jumpstarts the following school year, and then everything the adults need to be doing over the summer to get ready for that. And sometimes we're even lucky enough to have our students a little bit too. So the opening period starts about 2 weeks before students get in the building to about 3 weeks after school opens. The priorities are enculturing, preparing students for success in class. Rituals and routines here are even more important than the learning, because the things that we set, if we can eliminate bad habits, if we can get everybody used to how to do transitions, knowing what expectations are in terms of lunchtime, in terms of discipline, in terms of what teachers and student relationships are going to look like, setting this in the opening of school is huge for us, making sure that we have as few inorganic barriers to learning throughout the rest of the school year. We want to master those management routines. It may be that we take a lot of time and practice coming into class and leaving class until everybody has it in their mental muscle memory. We want to make sure that we have adult access to students. That could be a teacher from a previous year, a para. It could be an administrator. I mean, sometimes we even had it to where a custodian or a lunch person is the only person that can calm somebody down, and we call them in. It's an all hands on deck school year going into next year. So making sure at least every student has one person that has adult access is going to be critically important, especially for those that have huge gaps or that have certain behavioral issues where we need to make sure that we can monitor those and get them back on track quickly if they go astray. We're going to be setting work expectations of what performance looks like, what good work looks like, what good behavior looks like. And then we're going to jumpstart their critical reading, critical writing, and critical thinking through every single thing that we do. That could be both the lessons that we give, through some of the fun things that we do with them, even in terms of some of the things that we do for rewards or lunchtime, or how we open school in the morning or have the bus schedule in the afternoon. We're going to embed as much critical thinking as well as reading and writing as we can into every piece of it. So back to our model for just a second. Opening of school deals mostly with establishing this culture and climate, these rituals and routines that are going to facilitate student as learner and student as performer. We're just not worried about those pieces yet. Right now, we're just making sure that the building is ready, the classrooms are ready, the students are ready for that learning to happen. Now, we're not going to do this for each one of the periods, but because opening of school is so important for next year, we want to make sure that we always look at work broken down into 3 different groups. What should the students be doing? What should the leaders be doing? What should the teachers be doing? In the book, we have this broken down for each one of the periods. For the purposes of how much we're going to get out of this particular session, I really want to make sure that we're thinking in these 3 concepts for at least the opening, and then we can take on the other periods at some time down the road. We're going to be covering quite a bit today. The students need to master need to be encultured into their routines and rituals. That's both management, getting to and from class, what they do in the morning, what they do in the lunchroom, and the academic routines. What happens when teachers say to do something? What is the critical vocabulary, the operational language that's happening in that classroom? What does their learning work look like? That ability to pack all the way into long-term memory. We're not necessarily using all of our pieces of the learning process yet, but we want to get them used to at least what the chunks are, what the expectations will be. And then finally, what good work looks like in terms of performance. The leaders need to be taking all those summer plans and making sure that they're monitoring their systems. They need to have a special focus on data management so that they can quickly see if any red flags pop up for analysis purposes, or if some of the things that they're trying new this year seem to be working or not. Classroom visits need to be happening right from the beginning of the year, and as much teacher and student support as leaders can afford them time. It's so important, so critical that we enculture our teachers on what good work like, what our expectations are for them, as well as we are the students. And then the teachers' work, we need to be assessing where students are, diagnostics, making sure we give them the rituals and routines that will be expected of them this year, especially if you're trying something new. We need to make sure that learning and performing work is embedded into all of how they're thinking about their lesson plans. And finally, we need to quickly identify students who's maybe coming out of the pandemic year, the gap has increased in terms of if they're off grade. We need to make sure that we identify students that may have developed social, emotional, behavioral problems over the pandemic year. So the teacher's work is going to be one of your lifelines of good, solid, real-time data that the leaders are going to need to work with and find out through a force rank priorities what they're going to do first. You can't do everything. So knowing everything that needs to be done and then force ranking those needs is a critical piece to making sure leadership is opening school well. We open school until school is opened, meaning that until these rituals and routines, until everything is understood, what the expectations are in terms of how the opening of the day, the closing of the day, the lunchtime things, we hope it opens within three weeks. If we haven't opened school properly, we may still be opening school in December. We may still be opening school in March, still focusing on making sure people are using those rituals and routines, especially if you're in a school that has high turnover of either teachers or of students. But we're going to start the formative period on the 4th week, no matter what. It's just that if we haven't opened school properly, opening a school may be concurrent until that's even into the calibrating period. So this is our last activity for the day. We're going to go pretty quickly through the rest of the school year after this. But since the opening of school is so important to where you are, I want to have everybody that wants to pause right now, individually maybe look at my opening of school readiness checklist, and then come back together and see if we thought the same things in terms of what's good, what's bad, what are the priorities for the things that we need to work on. It's great to get everybody's personal assessment and then use like a Venn diagram to overlay those and see, do we think that we're working at the same school or not? Do we think we have the same priorities? Calibration of reality is one of the big deals that leadership needs to work on. If people don't think something is an issue, they may not put it as a priority. Leadership needs to help define what those issues are and then calibrate all their people behind them to make sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction. So if you have time right now, go ahead and take a look at the readiness. By the way, in the toolkit, I've given you readiness tools for all of the different periods that we'll be going through. But also on our website, we have plenty of tools for each one of the periods that I think you'll really find effective, and they're all free. We give all this stuff away. We just want to help as many of our kids as we can out there. So please feel free to take this readiness assessment, and then we'll push on through the rest of the school year fairly quickly. So coming out of the opening of school period, we're going to enter the formative period. This is where we really focus on breaking down barriers that keep students from learning, keep them from getting things into long-term retrievable memory. The formative period starts usually about 3 weeks in, or whenever you feel like you've properly opened school. If opening of school takes quite a bit of the year, you may actually be working concurrently for a while between opening of school and formative period. But if everything goes well at the beginning of the year, we're talking about 3 weeks in until winter break. We're building independent learners. We're making sure that the teacher doesn't have to kick off the processing and the work that the students do. We're increasing the potential as a performer. We're expanding the base of their attitude, of their perception of self, making sure that they understand what what good work looks like. We're focusing on critical reading, writing, and thinking strategies through almost every single thing, every single lesson that we do, because most lessons should not be necessarily centered around what's taught, but what students' work looks like. From that, we'll figure out what we have to teach them and what things we may give them to learn on their own through the work that's happening, the struggle time to do it. But ultimately, we want students making meaning in a way that allows them to pack things into that long-term retrievable memory. We want to make sure that the basic reading and performing competencies are there. Some students don't have reading stamina. Some students can't critical read. They're butterfly readers or butterfly thinkers. We're going to make sure that they have all the abilities they need to make long-term lasting memories out of things. And then we want to increase their best effort comfort zone. What does good work look like? And let's start to push them harder on what they're capable of producing. All of these things are setting the stage for us to look at them as performer and then figure out where their work is breaking down. So if we've built students as learners, we've increased the performance of the student potential. In the calibrating period, we're going to focus on students as performers, going back to that 5-legged model. The calibrating period starts when we come back from winter break and ends 2 to 3 weeks before any sort of formal assessment or state testing that you might have. We're building proficient performance, and we're using the 5-legged model to identify where work is breaking down. We're mastering uses of content. We're making sure that they are able to produce work at an equivalent performance level to what the state will be expecting or whatever high stakes assessment that they might have to use. And we're making sure that they have operational fluency. We want to make sure that we're using formal register, critical vocabulary. There's lots of things that go into making sure that we don't get them into a comfort zone with something informal and then expect them to do well in a very formal setting. We're building capacity. We're building duration of how much they have to read, the quickness with which they might have to read, the time that they might have to attend in terms of an assessment setting. So we're slowly building their capacity to perform at the level that will be assessed. We don't want them to know things and then not be able to show it because they got tired or because they didn't read quickly enough or because they just started phoning it in towards the end of the test. We're building their hearts and minds. We're building their perception of self. We're building their attitude towards giving best effort, as well as making sure that we're continuing to build all of our lessons around student work and putting things into long-term memory. Testing is one of those things that I don't know a lot of educators that love the idea of state testing. The accountability piece of it, the states need some way to keep schools accountable. All in on testing is not necessarily what a lot of educators would want, but we have to teach in the districts and states in which we are, not the ones that we wished were. So if we are going to have to go through a high stakes assessment, we're at least going to prepare our kids for success. So a few weeks before the state test, we're going to make sure that they're comfortable with their setting, that they know who their proctor is. We're going to identify the adults that need access to them if we have kids that have attitude problems or if they get thrown off or if they have a behavioral issue, because we're going to want to minimize discipline issues, minimize any places where we think that the reason why students might underperform might be something the adults didn't prep them for or the adults didn't have ready. We're going to be enabling long-term memory. We have quite a few processes that we use to make sure that they can go back and remember, cumulative visuals, hooks that we give them to go back, discussions that we have talking about something that may have happened back when a certain thing was taught. We're going to give them all the tips and tricks that we can to make sure that all of that memory is retrievable memory. The testing is such an interesting time too. In the book, and you don't have to buy the book, on the website we have a lot of these tools. The leadership plan needs to be in place way before the testing comes about. We don't want to have building going on. We don't want to have during testing things that distract outside of the windows. We don't want to have mowers going by. We don't want to have anything that can disrupt the students, especially for our students that are most susceptible to being distracted or being thrown off. As adults, we're going to eliminate all the barriers, all the adult barriers, and make sure that everything is built around student need for the course of the testing. Then the week after the testing, we're going to give them a little time to process what happened, deconstruct what they think their effort was like, ideas about how they might approach it for the next year, and make sure that that information gets passed on to the next year's teacher. What did they do well? What did they not? We're going to let the students have some ownership in terms of what their testing cycle was like and feeding ideas that they might need What were you prepared for? What were you underprepared for? And like I said, you don't have to reinvent the wheel on this. We have plenty of tools that we can share with you on making sure that students get to capture what went well and what didn't before we get out of the testing window. And finally, we have the end of year. Now, granted, a lot of us like to go, woo, field days, movies. No, the end of year is a critical time where we can reduce performance loss. We can encourage students over the summer to where some of the deficits that we saw during the year, use their talents and interests to bolster those particular areas. We can have adults build access. Sometimes we have an overlap where we have the next year's teachers go ahead and start to do some things, or even just take the entire class, so that some of that rapport is already built. We might be reviewing with students what their data look like for the year, having the students talk about what their plan is for next year, how could they do better, where do they think they could give more effort. If we bring students into the process, we put some sort of expectation on them, they're more likely to take ownership of their own learning. And that's really the key to developing long-term independent learners. And then planning. We should not go into the summer not knowing exactly what our summer plan is going to be. I usually like to have leadership start workshopping their ideas for the summer, middle of the calibrating period. Now, until you get through the testing cycle and you see how everything goes, you can't put a fine point on everything you're going to do. And really, the summer gets broken into two different groups anyway that we'll talk about in just a second. But there's not a minute of the end of year that should be wasted in terms of getting ready to open school for the next year. On the leadership side, on the teacher side, on the building access, and then even in terms of students deciding what they're going to end the year with and do this summer to become better students for the opening of school next year. So the summer is really different depending on your particular state, your particular school system. I don't know if everybody has access to their students or certain students over the summer. I don't know how much you have access to some of your teachers before 2 weeks before the school starts. So the summer is a little bit more of a variable depending on your particular business setting. The summer, we want to make sure that we reduce performance loss. And honestly, that's not just for the students, that's for the teachers as well. How can we sharpen the saw over the summer for all parties involved? We want to encourage students' interests and talents, especially if we don't have programs, maybe before students leave, we want to make sure that parents and students know what's out there that can keep their brains working over the summer. Continuing to build access, if we do have access to the students, developing those relationships to where there's a trust, there's an ability to calm down if folks get out of whack, if students are having a bad day, an adult that they'll actually talk to. Anything we can do over the summer to increase that relationship between adults and students is a win. It's just sometimes limited by the constraints of what your district has available for you. We want to make sure that the summer is a review of data. Now that's some of the data that we've been capturing through our data management systems throughout the school year. And then usually, depending on what state you're in, sometimes state testing data is available early in the summer. We usually bifurcate the summer, thinking we spend most of June processing how the year went and how we would do the next year differently. And then once we have our formal data sets come out, spend the rest of the summer figuring out what seemed to work well, what didn't, and then really putting a fine point on how we're going to open school, and then the value that we're going to add to each one of the periods throughout the year. Now, just a couple final notes. First, if you're school leadership, if you're some of the people that are the school coaches, or maybe even at the district level watching this is not something that you can do without everybody pitching in. So we are going to have to spend most of our time becoming servant leaders and empowering our folks. One of our key jobs as leaders is to make sure that we remove all of the barriers that our teachers and our students have to having a great school year. Beyond that, we need to make sure things are enforced. We need to do the planning that we need to, but ultimately our main job there is to reduce barriers to success for our folks. And only the leadership can own that. But if we have everybody on board, if we have everybody taking ownership and feeling empowered, many hands make light work. So in terms of the rhythm of the learning year, we build the year around student need. We build our reading times around what's best for students, not what's best for adults. We don't bifurcate a reading time because it works better for adults putting a lunch period in a certain place. Everything we build operationally takes student need as the highest priority. We create a culture and climate for learning. We build independent, proficient performers. We want to make sure that the perception of what independent and proficient is common amongst both our teachers and our students. We want to make sure we have hearts and minds so that we're always getting great product from our students. They're wanting to give us everything that they know, especially in terms of the state assessment, and that we're using these principles even more so coming out of this crazy topsy-turvy COVID year. We have data that's not going to be necessarily apples to apples with what next year is going to look like. We might have huge turnover in terms of leadership, teaching, our teachers and of students. So opening school next year is going to be one of the most critical because we're probably likely to see the largest gaps having grown, the most depletion of rituals and routines, and going into a year as blind as we've ever been in terms of data sets. So it's going to be critical that we open next year well, and that's all going to be done through planning this summer. A few final thoughts, a few little cherries on top in terms of the learning, the performing, and then the story arc that the learner year gives us. Anything that you try should be tracked for implementation and impact. Is it being rolled out? Is it being used? Is it showing, is it something that's helping? If we install a new program, if we install a new process, if we can install a standard operating procedure, and we don't track it for efficacy, then we don't know if we're actually helping or not. Remember, we want to start with the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm with any new process that we create. If some of these ideas that we've addressed today through the learner year, through how long-term memory is what we're talking about in terms of learning, and how we have both cognitive and non-cognitive pieces of performance that need to be analyzed to find out where work is breaking down, this could be a little bit of a culture shift for some of your folks, your faculty, your students. There could be some growing pains getting into this very self-initiated, independent learning mode that we want to put all students into. So it may have to be reinforced quite a bit. You may have to have a slow, gradual release rollout of it. Maybe be a multi-year process in terms of you getting to optimal learner year methodologies. This is going to require professional development and patience in terms of that professional development being implemented. Anything we can do to support, anything that we can do to break barriers, any remediation that needs to be done as leaders, we need to make sure that we are enabling our schools for success if we're going to use this model. And finally, data. We should be tracking what we're doing at a student level, at a teacher level, at a school level, knowing what's working, what's not. If we try interventions, tracking that. If we try some external counseling, if we try bringing in some outside folks, what's working, what's not. We don't have time to waste on things that don't work. So we need to be making sure that we are building in data sets from the get-go to tell us what's working and what's not. Thank you so much for your time today. We've been in business 22 years. We've been refining these ideas, the research, the pieces of this that we personally use as practitioners out in schools and classrooms. And we're very happy to pass this on to other educators. We do have books if you want to get deeper into the research or deeper into the what's and whys things came about. But if our toolkit can help you, our free tools can help you, the blog helps you, please just take our stuff and run with it. We just really appreciate your time, and we hope you have a great school year. We're all in this together, and if we can ever be of any help, please feel free to reach out. Have a great day and a great conference. Thank you.